inshallah. But I am excited. All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everybody. Inshallah, we're going to be continuing our tafsir, and we yesterday left at a point, I believe point number 12 with Tafsir al-Qurtubi. He was talking about doing al-ayman, doing an oath, and if that oath was done based, or at least the person is swearing by other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and in particular Illat, which was an idol that they used to worship at the time, then in that situation the Prophet ﷺ was directing them to say La ilaha illallah as a way of kafara, in other words, an expiation for swearing by other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So even if we said somebody would swear by holy cow, or probably swear by Jesus Christ, or anything of that sort, they would basically not consider that as an oath, but consider that as requiring kafarat la ilaha illallah, unless the person believed in that. So if the person believed in Jesus Christ being God, or believed in a holy cow, or believed in probably Lat, etc., then in that situation, they would have to redo their Islam and redo their Shahada. But if they meant by that as a just their own tongue slipping, they didn't mean anything with it. Even if they didn't mean anything with it and just their tongue slipping, what they would be doing is basically saying La ilaha illallah as a way to rewire their brain and connect themselves and their deen basically with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We also talked about man qala li sahibihi ta'ala uqamirk falyatasaddaq. If a person were to tell another person that he's betting them on something, then they would have to do sadaqah. We talked about that. And we also talked about this hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, a Sahabi, basically he just swore by Lat wal Uzza, and then of course the Sahaba were at him, you said a wrong thing, kind of like uh, a common thing that people would do, booing, or probably just making some sound and telling them that you just did something wrong. They would come to the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ basically taught him that slip of the tongue, all he needed to do was say La ilaha illallah وحده لا شريك له له الملك وله الحمد وهو على كل شيء قدير. Blow on the left side for 3 times and say أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. We also went in certain details with that, and right now, of course, we're actually left at that one. Abu Hanifa said if a person were to say this person is Jewish, Christian, or this person is not Muslim anymore, etc. Well, here's the thing. When you look at this and what was said, in English, it's quite hard to interpret and to translate, because if you were to say, call somebody, you're accusing them of being Jewish, you're accusing them of being Christian, etc., it makes no sense that this would be some kind of an oath. But according to some scholars, by if a person had intended to accuse the person that way by saying, well, he would not be on the faith of Islam if such a thing was true, etc. Well, according to Abu Hanifa, he regarded that that's a kind of an oath, and that the person is required to pay a kafara. A person is required to pay a kafara, or required to pay an expiation. Well, that really depends on what the person really meant by that. Did they really mean to say and accuse this person of being Jewish, Christian, or whatever other religion? Or did he really want to say that he was really honest about something? So that's that tricky piece of it. I'm not going to go into details with that one. But of course, all scholars had unanimously agreed if the person were to say, "Uqsimu billah," I swear by Allah, that that would be considered as an oath. Then they had differences of opinions if the person were to say, "Uqsim aw ashhadu," or that such a thing is going to happen and without even saying billah. So the person said, Ashhad that such a thing is going to happen, or Uqsim that such a thing is going to happen, or I'm making an oath that such a thing is going to happen. Did they say billah? Did they say that they were really swearing by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that they were actually making an oath by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? They didn't say that it was by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Would it still be considered as an oath? Would it not be considered as an oath? That's that place of opinion that scholars actually had. So they had the first group basically said it would be yameen, it would still be considered an oath based on Malik if the intention was that they meant to say that they swear by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even though they didn't actually say by Allah, but of course, according to Malik, that it would still be considered an oath. Okay, Abu Hanifa and al-Awza'i. Al-Awza'i was from Lebanon. Abu Hanifa and al-Awza'i, al-Hasan and al-Nakhi, well, they said it would be considered an oath in two different situations. And you had some scholars actually say that it would not be an oath because this person didn't even swear by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They began the oath, but it was incomplete. Okay, let's see. What if the person said, I swear that you're going to do this and this. So what are they doing? They're swearing that I'm going to do, but I didn't say I was going to do it. Did that mean that the person, that if he's seeking to request that he would do such a thing, then in that situation, there's no kafara. But if he said, Wallahi, you're going to eat, for example, okay? Wallahi, you're going to eat, uh, I don't know, the cheesecake right now. And he doesn't like cheesecake. Should he eat the cheesecake? If he doesn't eat the cheesecake, am I going to do the kafara or is he going to do the kafara? The person that swore, the person that made the oath, if that guy doesn't eat the cheesecake, then you would have to pay the kafara. The person, not the person that didn't eat the cheesecake, but the person that made the oath. Okay, let's see. What if the person basically made an oath and the oath was not by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala directly? In other words, it wasn't necessarily a specific description. It was basically making an oath perhaps uh, on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, khalqillah, rizqillah, baytillah, based on al-Kaaba. Made the oath on al-Kaaba. Okay? Or rizqillah. You know, in Bilad al-Sham, we say some people would basically say وحياة النعمة. They'll basically make the oath with the ni'mah, with the different blessings that they have. Well, that's actually shirk. Any oath other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would be considered shirk, to make the oath based on the blessings that you have, or perhaps the house or the child that you probably have, or whatever it is, that would be considered as shirk. Let's continue. If the person had basically did the oath, then there's one thing. There would be a kafara, but there is something else that the person can do, which is called al-istithna. What is al-istithna? So we know that al-kafara, the expiation, would be feeding 10 needy people, or clothing 10 needy people, or freeing a slave, or if the person can't afford any of that, then they would be required to fast 3 days. Okay. Now, here's one thing. There's something called al-istithna. What is al-istithna? Al-istithna is basically ending it with inshallah. Inshallah, as an example. It's not exclusive to that. So what does that look like? Wallahi, Nura, you're going to eat that cake, inshallah. What happened? That inshallah, well, Nura didn't want to eat the cheesecake. And I said, inshallah. I was afraid that if she didn't want to eat the cheesecake because of probably her own reason, she didn't like cheesecake. So I just said, inshallah. That inshallah, that's that istithna. That's that exception. So I just basically said, inshallah. All right. Ibn al-Majishun. Ibn al-Majishun. Who's Ibn al-Majishun? Let's look at Ibn al-Majishun and just learn a little bit about Ibn al-Majishun, right? Who is that? So Ibn al-Majishun, just a note, he actually died 213 year Hijriya. Let's just learn a little bit about him. He's actually a key scholar for the Maliki madhab. Let's see, he said, Al-Allama, Al-Faqih, Mufti al-Madina, Abu Marwan. Nice name. Allama. Allama is like a great scholar. Faqih, scholar in fiqh. Mufti al-Madina. Mufti al-Madina, he was basically the main scholar for al-Madina. Okay. Abd al-Malik ibn al-Imam, that's his name. Okay. He was mawlahum. So it was basically a mawla. He was mawla meaning an ex-slave. He was also the direct student for Imam Malik. Can't beat that. Direct student for Imam Malik.
Where was he from? Like what country?
So we don't really know what country he's from. We just know that he was living in Medina. You want to keep in mind, a lot of these ex-slaves, it's hard to keep track exactly where they're from. Okay. Let's see. This one was kind of weird to me. Let's see, Ibn Abd al-Barr, he said, كان فقيها فصيحا. He was a very eloquent scholar in Islamic jurisprudence. دارت عليه الفتية في زمانه. In fact, all the futya, what is it, futya? Futya is like all the different matters that relate to people's matters and jurisprudence was actually going to be circulating. In other words, he was like the center of it. And it was also going around his father. His father was also the center of this. The word is darir, meaning blind. But then some scholars actually said he became blind at the end of his life. Now, this one was really rather astonishing. كان مولعا بسماع الغناء. That he was obsessed with listening to songs. Wait a minute. He was obsessed with listening to songs. You want to keep in mind, al-ghina is not like today, okay? When we're speaking about that he was obsessed with listening to songs, it usually means poetry. So usually means poetry. It doesn't mean that there was a music involved and, the number of times that he would probably hear a poem or anything of that sort and probably would be sung in a certain way. It would be completely different than today. Okay, so I don't want someone to take this out of context and think that, yeah, we could just, get obsessed, just like Ibn al-Majishun was obsessed with listening to songs and think of it as, oh, it actually is talking about music and all the different kinds of music. Just be careful with that, because you have to keep that in mind, that their time was completely different. The lyrics are completely different. The music is completely different. So it wasn't like what we would have today. And even if he wanted to listen to a song, it wasn't as available as today. Okay. What does it mean? Like right now, you could just put on some of the best, at least what I mean by best, I mean, I guess the best in terms of the music, basically all the music sounds, and that itself, and all those conductors and all of those. You've got a whole team that basically was making sure that that song was, all set to get into the best presentation. Okay. But that wasn't the case at that time. It wasn't the case at that time. It was very simple lyrics. It was very, well, it could be sophisticated, but definitely not the type of lyrics that had shirk in it, didn't have the type of lyrics where it's describing haram things, didn't have the lyrics that were, the type of lyrics that were describing men or women in certain ways that are to excite lust and all of that. That wasn't the type of ghina that this is talking about. So just want to make sure that we don't take this out of context. Okay. Let's see. كان لا يعقل الحديث، يعني لم يكن من فرسانه، وإلا هو ثقة في نفسه. This one's rather strange. Said he did not understand the hadith. It's not that he didn't understand it, but what he said, what he wanted to say is that he wasn't necessarily from the highest level of, at least, specialty in the knowledge or in the science of hadith. Let's see, he died 213-year hijrah. Okay, let's go back. Now we know that Ibn al-Majishun was one of the students of Imam Malik, and in fact, direct student for Imam Malik, lived in Medina. Can't beat that. And he said, al-istithna'u badalun an al-kafara. That exception that you would do when you say wallahi and then inshallah at the end, that would actually be instead of il-kafara, instead of the expiation. So if the person made the yameen and said inshallah, that's basically an alternative, and therefore you don't necessarily have to pay the kafara. You won't have to pay the expiation. Okay, let's see. Now, Ibn Umar, where did they get that from? Well, you had Ibn al-Arabi first. Let's first go to Ibn al-Arabi. He said majority of the scholars, and majority that is fuqaha, I'm sorry, we're talking about the Malikis here. He said, and this is basically what they would regard, and this is the most preponderant. When we say well was sahih in this context, it doesn't mean authentic, but it means preponderant. And the condition, in order for us to consider this exception, this inshallah, to be valid, it would simply have to be connected. What does it mean? It would have to be connected with the actual oath. So not that saying, for example, Wallahi, you're going to eat the cheesecake, or Wallahi, I'm going to eat the cheesecake. And then 2 hours later, inshallah. No, that wasn't connected to it. And therefore, majority of the scholars, they basically said, no, that's not valid right there. You would have to you would have to do, of course, the expiation for it. So this is what they're saying. It has to be connected. And it has to منطوقا به لفظا. What does that mean? It has to be uttered. So it's not that, yeah, I made the yamin, Wallah, I'm going to eat the cheesecake. Okay, I don't know why I keep on coming to this example, but thought of doing something simple and something really clear. Okay, let's just say somebody made this oath like that. In that situation, okay, it has to be, in order for us to consider this exception as valid, it has to be connected to it, mantuqa. It has to be uttered. So not that on the inside, inshallah, on the inside, meaning in your intention that you basically are saying inshallah. No, it has to be uttered. You have to have said it. Ibn Umar, let's look at this hadith. So this is narrated by Nasa'i, and Abu Dawood. Let's see, look at number 5. Here are the references. And let's see, Ibn Umar had mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man halafa fastathna, فإن شاء مضى وإن شاء ترك غير حنث." What does that mean? That the Prophet ﷺ had said, whoever had made an oath and then did al-istithna. What is al-istithna? Meaning that they had basically said insha'Allah, then in that situation, they can continue with the oath, or they would basically leave, in other words, not implement what they had made the oath in, and they would not be considered as somebody that had broken their oath. So this is وَإِنْ شَاءَ تَرَكَ غَيْرَ حَنِث. غَيْرَ حَنِث meaning if الحنث في اليمين basically means that you had broken the oath. Okay, so if you say inshallah, this is the evidence. من حلف فاستثنى فإن شاء مضى وإن شاء ترك غير حنث. This is basically the key to what we're talking about. Let's see. فإن نواه من غير نطق أو قطعه من غير عذر لم ينفعه. Okay, if the person basically intended that exception, that insha'Allah, if they just intended it without uttering it, without mentioning it, or they basically had probably interrupted that oath without a reason to it, then in that situation, that exception would not be considered. What does that mean? So let's say I'm saying, Wallahi, I'm going to eat the cheesecake. Here goes our cheesecake again. Wallahi, I'm going to eat the cheesecake. And then you hear a loud sound in the background. And then just when I said cheesecake, I wanted to say inshallah, but the boom sound just kind of made me stop and pause because I basically got scared. It startled me, basically. And in that situation, this is a udhr, that there was something that startled me, and that was the only thing. After I was sure that the boom wasn't anything dangerous, I said inshallah. Then that would be considered as, yes, I don't have to pay a kafara if I didn't eat the cheesecake. Okay? But let's just say that there was no good reason, like a valid reason. Like what? I didn't say inshallah. I just said, well, I'm going to eat the cheesecake. And then later on, everything was normal. I mean, and then all of a sudden I said inshallah. Then in that situation, it wasn't connected with the actual yameen. Then in that situation, I would have to pay the kafara if I don't eat the cheesecake. Okay, let's continue. قال محمد ibn al-Mawaz. Who's that? That's basically a Maliki scholar. Okay, and let's continue. He said it would be يكون الاستثناء مقترنا باليمين اعتقادا ولو بآخر حرف. So it was basically said الاستثناء would be connected to the oath just by the person basically, in other words, having the intention for it, even if that was the last letter. What does that mean? So even if the person delayed insha'Allah, okay, to the end of that oath, that would still be considered as basically making that exception. Okay, let's see. But if the person had ended the yameen and then wanted to say the insha'Allah, that exception, let's call it the exception, then that would not necessarily work, because the actual oath was done and it was complete without this exception. So saying it later would basically mean like it's a completely different sentence. Now here's one thing. Al-Maliki, Al-Qurtubi al-Maliki, of course, he said, but this is actually refuted by this hadith, من حلف فاستثنى. How did you get there? He said, well, you look at this hadith, من حلف فاستثنى. He said, look, the hadith was saying فاستثنى. Here's that fat right there. Oops, hold on. Wanted to do that fat, but then, okay, here we go. Here it is. You see this fat right there? Okay, that fat right there, he basically said, وَالْفَاءُ لِلتَّعْقِيبِ. And what does that mean? So this fat is coming as a later thing and not necessarily right away. And he said in that situation, the ta'qib, or at least that exception or that commentary that came later, it wasn't necessarily directly connected with it. There was a time lapse according to what he's saying. Okay. And that's a thing. That the scholars actually had differences of opinions. When would this istithna or this exception be considered? Would it be considered if there was a time lapse, or would there not be a time lapse? How long, how soon does the time lapse have to be? Let's see. Let's look at it. Sorry, I'm just trying to change my position. All right. So let's see. He said, وَاخْتَلَفَ أَصْحَابُنَا. Who's Ibn Khuwaizimandad? Ibn Khuwaizimandad was one of the Maliki scholars that lived in Iraq. Okay? And he said, and when he says Ashabuna, that actually means the Maliki scholars. And he said they had differences of opinions if the person had basically done that exception within themselves, and whether that would actually be considered as a valid exception or not. So the first opinion said, yes, it would be valid. So what does that look like? I'm basically right there. You're asking me, did you eat my cheesecake? And I said, Wallahi. Or are you going to eat my cheesecake? Yeah, Wallahi, I am. And on the inside, I'm keeping it on the inside, inshallah. But then she was dependent on you that you were going to eat the cheesecake. And what happened? Well, ظلم المحلوف له. According to the first opinion, that wasn't fair for the person that you had made an oath for. Because you just said, inshallah, but the other person was not aware that you had actually did that exception. In other words, you're not going to be committed to your oath. So that's the first opinion, that sure, it's valid, but that's not fair for the person that you're making the oath for. The second opinion, that no, this would not be valid unless the other person hears that exception, because they need to know that you're really not committed fully. In other words, they really need to hear it, and it's not enough for you to make on your own exception, and the other person is not even hearing that you're not really committed to the oath. This third one, they basically said, well, we would consider it if the person basically only had moved their tongue and their lips with it, even if the person didn't hear it. How did we get there? Ibn Khuwaizimandad, he said, well, the reason why we said it would be considered, because anyways, the whole thing about an oath is all about intention anyways. How did you get it's all about intention? He said, anyways, the ayah said, عَقَّدْتُمُ الْأَيْمَانِ. It's all about, you didn't just say wallahi and then we're going to consider it unless you really had your own intention. You really attempted to swear by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore, it's all about intention. So to say that the exception was not going to be accepted or considered valid unless it was uttered, well, how come the amen you said it was going to be considering based on the intention? Where did you get the exception that it would not be considered as based on the intention? And, it's just, yeah, well, I'm just letting you get the taste of fiqh right there, okay? All right. So just look into look into that. You know what I liked? Let's say Ibn Abbas. Let's look at this story. Okay. Ibn Abbas, he said, well, istithna or the exception can actually happen even after a year. Okay, hold on. Well, I didn't complete this one. I should actually complete it before I would go to Ibn Abbas, right? Let's see what he said. إنما قلنا لا يصح ذلك حتى يحرك به لسانه وشفتيه فإن لم يحرك به لسانه وشفتيه لم يكن متكلما. What did he want to say? Well, he wanted to respond. That is al-Qurtubi. He said to actually say that no, it can be based on the intention and not necessarily have to be uttered. He said, well, the reason why we're saying that no, it has to be uttered is basically because you would not be considered as really talking, I mean, and making an oath and making an exception unless you actually speak. And spoken words are only done by moving your lips and by moving your mouth. Otherwise, that wouldn't be considered as getting or being qualified. It doesn't qualify to say that, yes, this is an exception by simply just having it intentional thing. No, you need to have the intention to make the oath and also speak the oath and also speak the exception, the inshallah, for it to be considered as valid. Otherwise, it wouldn't be considered valid because it wouldn't be spoken at all because you had spoken the yameen and we said your yameen / your oath would not be considered valid unless you had spoken the oath. If you didn't say the oath, then there would be no oath in the first place because you didn't even say anything. Just by having the intention, we said it wasn't going to be valid. Well, that's the same thing with the exception, according to, of course, al-Qurtubi right there. Okay, Ibn Abbas, he basically said something rather strange. Let's look at what he said. He said, well, the exception would be valid even if it's after a whole year. A whole year? So I made an oath a year, 1 year later, I basically said, Inshallah. Well, and what is the evidence? Where did you get that from? He said, well, I've got an evidence. Let's look at this ayah. This ayah basically said, وَالَّذِينَ لَا يَدْعُونَ مَعَ اللَّهِ إِلَهًا آخَرَ. Well, this was revealed as one ayah right there. Those that do not worship other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then it stopped. And then it wasn't until after a year that the rest of the ayah was revealed, إِلَّا مَنْ تَابَ, except those that had repented. So he said, well, we could see وَالَّذِينَ لَا يَدْعُونَ مَعَ اللَّهِ إِلَهًا آخَرَ, those people that would not worship or associate partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Basically, they're going to be punished for their shirk, etc. And then it wasn't until a year later did it actually reveal إِلَّا مَنْ تَابَ, even though it was continuing this ayah, and it connected it with this ayah, وَالَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ مَعَ اللَّهِ إِلَهًا آخَرَ وَلَا يَزْنُونَ, and then it would continue إِلَّا مَنْ تَابَ وَآمَنَ وَعَمِلَ صَالِحًا, etc. So, well, wait a minute. Did it still consider it as a coherent part of that ayah, even though it was a year later. Yes, it's considered a part of that ayah, even though it was a year later. Well, that wasn't just Ibn Abbas, but let's go farther. You got Mujahid. He said that the exception can happen even after 2 years. Sa'id ibn Jubair, he said 4 months. Tawus, he basically said, well, as long as he's sitting down within that, let's call it majlis, meaning as long as it's within this setting, then he could say inshallah any minute, as long as he didn't get up that setting. So we're right there. I'm going to eat that cheesecake. And we're still sitting. We didn't move. And he's like, inshallah. Then according to Tawus, well, as long as it's within the setting, that's fine. That exception is valid. Let's see, Qatada said, well, it depends. It's supposed to be based on before, the exception is supposed to be before he would get up and also before saying anything else. And then, let's see, Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Ishaq ibn Rahoya, he basically said, as long as that subject is there that we're talking about, we didn't change the subject, we're still on the same topic, we're still consistent with that, then if later he says, inshallah, and we're still within the same topic, then that's a valid exception. Let's see, Ata said, well, it's basically the amount that it would take to milk a camel, which would probably be around 20 minutes. Okay. Well, naqat al-ghasir, it would be around 15, 20 minutes. You're just about that. Okay. Let's see. This one's rather interesting. Ibn al-Arabi, now he wants to scrutinize all those opinions. It's like, okay, 2 years, no 4 months, no. It depends on the setting. It depends on that. Ibn al-Arabi said, as for Ibn Abbas, in talking about this ayah, he said, well, that's actually not a valid, I guess, evidence in this matter. Why not? He said, because when you're looking at the revelation for this ayah, it was already there in al-Lawh al-Mahfuz, in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge, that illa man tab, that those that would repent would be excluded from the eternal punishment. But that was already known in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's knowledge. But the reason why it was revealed later was really for a wisdom that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had kept. But that doesn't mean that that's an evidence that we can make our sentences a year apart and still consider it coherent. If that sentence was incomplete till a year later, he said, that's not an evidence to prove that a year later you can complete your sentence and actually make an exception to your sentence a year later and use this ayah as your evidence. He said, because you're looking at this ayah when it was revealed later, it was to bring about clarity to a matter that they didn't know, but that's not an evidence to use for Yameen. And of course, Al-Qurtubi also wanted to support what Ibn al-Arabi said. And he said, well, when you look at that ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had exposed one side of the ayah, and then the second part, which is illa man tab, didn't yet reveal that ayah. But when you're that's the same thing. فكذلك الحالف إذا حلف إرهابا وأخفى الاستثناء. It could be possible, okay, that a person might make an oath, but then they probably couldn't do that exception because they were probably afraid to do the exception at the time. So does that qualify that there was a wisdom, there was a reason? That's why I couldn't say it at that time. So I had to delay it later on until I was safe to do so. I want to read this story for you. Of course, they're still debating, but I want you to look at this debate, to look at this story. Ibn al-Arabi mentions a story. It's a little relevant, irrelevant. Just listen to the story and you'll see it. Abu al-Fadl al-Maraghi. Where's Abu al-Fadl al-Maraghi from? Abu al-Fadl al-Maraghi is from Azerbaijan. Where is that? Let's look at where Azerbaijan is, so that way we would know who we're talking about. Okay, here's Azerbaijan. Okay, and let's see. He was coming all the way to Iraq. So Azerbaijan is right there. Basically traveled. Look at those mountains, man. Those, ya ilahi. You had to travel those kind of mountains in order to come to Iraq. Yeah, it wasn't like today. It was really tough. Okay, so he mentions a story. Abu al-Fadl al-Maraghi was reading, or in other words, studying in Al-Iraq. Medinat al-Salam is basically Baghdad. And then he would always get these letters coming from his own country, but he wasn't reading those letters. He would just put it in this box and just insert it in this box and would not read any of them. Why? He was afraid that if he was going to, I guess, get this letter, that something might actually interrupt or upset him, and then probably interrupt his, I guess, enthusiasm for seeking ilm. Then after 5 years had passed, and then, of course, he got to a certain amount of education. They didn't have a bachelor's, master's, etc. But it was for 5 years, he was seeking ilm. And then it was time for him to go, basically got himself all ready. And then he got those notes out that he was never reading. And then he started reading what was in those letters as if it just got there. And then, of course, he was happy that he didn't read any of these at the time when basically he received it. And of course, when when it was time for him to go, basically, alhamdulillah, that he didn't read it, got himself ready on basically the hunchback, the camel, whatever it is. Basically, then he goes to the main entrance to leave Baghdad and basically get ready to go all the way to Khurasan. And then, of course, he basically had this guy that was kind of like a guide and that was helping him in order to travel. And then he basically stays at a place kind of like a bakery or a place where they're doing, I guess they're doing wheat and, crushing the wheat, maybe collecting the wheat. But basically they're basically, you know, like a bakery and with all the different things that they were doing for bread. So he goes to him, gets basically his rest and just is listening to what he's saying. One of these guys tells the other guy, did you not hear what the other scholar was saying? Meaning one of, kind of like a scholar, or at least a wa'al, basically like a teacher, the local teacher. He said, you know what he was saying? That Ibn Abbas had permitted that one would do that exception for their oath, even if it was after a year. This guy, who was just a person working in making bread and all of that, he said, I was actually thinking about that, and it really occupied me when I heard that. And he said, well, I started thinking about that. And then If that was actually true, so this is this Femi still speaking, this baker guy, or that guy that works in wheat. And he said, you know what? If that was actually true, then why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tell Prophet Ayyub alayhi salam, وَخُذْ بِيَدِكَ ضِغْثًا فَاضْرِبْ بِهِ وَلَا تَحْنَثْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told Prophet Ayyub alayhi salam, take a whole set of a dhugh. What is a dhugh? A dhugh is like a whole group of wheat. And since you made the oath to spank your wife, and a certain amount of spanks or a certain amount, he wanted to basically hit his wife. So then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells him, take a whole bundle of wheat and just spank her with it. And that way, it would be as if you had spanked her the number of times that you had wanted to spank her when you had not known what she was trying to do. وَلَا تَحْنَثْ, and don't break your oath. And he said, well, what prevented him from just saying, Insha'Allah? Now, here's one thing. What did he recognize? So that Abu al-Fadl al-Maraghi, he was just listening to these people, laborers, really simple laborers, and they were just discussing fiqh, really. He said, when I heard that these people, even though they were just simple laborers working in making bread and basically working in simple jobs like that, and they also had a good amount of ilm, I knew that I should not be going to the city of Maragha, which basically is a city in Azerbaijan. He said I would never go there. So he basically went to the person that was his guide and let him go, basically. He didn't want to hire him anymore and stayed in Baghdad till he died. Okay. So what is that supposed to tell us? Just this conversation, I guess, like I said, relevant or irrelevant, just so that we would just see that sometimes the place that you would stay in, it really has an influence on how much of ilm the people have. And subhanAllah, you would see the society, it would be, that takes me back to Palestine. Takes me back to Palestine. Young children, because they're consistently hearing about the news, and it's related to their life, they're hearing the news, they're, of course, living in a situation where it's politically heated, and it's always, of course, relating to their life, whether it's the shooting, whether it's the political situation, whether it's the colonists, basically colonizers, basically what are called the settlers, whatever, they would come and attack people, and what's really happening, who's coming in, etc. All of that is basically making the children speak on matters of politics like they're adults. The same thing when we're speaking about areas where when children are exposed to ilm, even if they're not necessarily getting into those schools, but just by having the environment speak in such a way, those are the cities that you would want to stay in, because it affects your thoughts, it affects who you are, it affects your identity, it affects your children, it affects you without you realizing. Just wanted to note that. SubhanAllah, I mean, really interesting. I would love to hear what your take on the story is, on your story is. And I also like the part that he didn't read those notes. until 5 years had passed. Why? Because he didn't want anything disrupting his talab al-ilm. He wanted to make sure that nothing would pop up. And I guess that's one main distraction with our phones. All these things are popping up, notifications, etc. And then we're getting distracted from seeking ilm. Seeking ilm is definitely requiring full attention. If you don't have your full attention, you're going to basically get disrupted and interrupted. And then without you realizing, then you're going away from seeking ilm. Let's continue right there. الاستثناء إنما يرفع اليمين بالله تعالى. Said, well, in order to consider al-istithna, or at least that exception, it would be considered as basically something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give you as a rukhsa. What is a rukhsa? A rukhsa is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give you as a permission. And there's no differences of opinions. But then they had differences of opinions. If the person were to do istithna by other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what does al-istithna look like? Let's say, if we're speaking about things like, I'm going to eat that cheesecake if Noura wants. Okay? Wallah, I'm going to eat that cheesecake if Noura wants. What if, I don't know if Noura wants that to happen or not. But let's say she changed her mind. Is that exception valid or not? That's that differences of opinion. If we're talking about exception other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All right, let's continue right there. And of course, they had differences of opinions on exceptions being valid if we're speaking about divorce or al-itaq. What is al-itaq? Al-itaq is freeing slaves. Would that be considered as a valid exception? If, for example, the man tells his wife, you're divorced and I'm divorcing you. Inshallah. Can we actually do that? What if I'm divorcing you if you leave out the door? And she leaves out the door. And then we'll say, did you really mean a divorce? But she left the door. Now she left and got out of the door, and he said, you are divorced. Well, in that situation, we would then ask, did you mean, that's the first opinion, did you mean that she would be divorced if she were to go out the door? Or did you mean to prevent her from going out the door? Some scholars, they said no. He literally said she would be divorced. That's a literal word. Why go for any other interpretation when the wording is obvious? That's the second opinion. What is preponderant? Wallahu a'lam, the intention is key to letting us know what the person really means by his words. Okay? And just to keep that one in mind. Okay, number 19, kafaratuhu. What does the kafara look like? What does the kafara look like? The kafara basically would be the expiation. How do we do that expiation? Can it happen before? Can we do the kafara before we even break our oath? Let's say you had 3 different opinions in that regards. Can we do the expiation before I even break my yameen, before I even break my oath? So what does that look like? Let's say I said, Wallahi, I'm going to eat that cheesecake. But then Noura doesn't even bring cheesecake. Uh-oh. Well, she didn't even bring the cheesecake. She made carrot cake. Where's the cheesecake? Noura thought, well, I didn't have enough cream cheese, so I didn't do it. Uh-oh. But I said, Wallah, I'm going to eat cheesecake. Now there's no cheesecake. What's going to happen? Okay. Well, now I'm stuck. I'll just pay the kafara. So I had some right away. I basically on my phone decided to pay right away. Of course, decided to pay the kafara. I guess and just online. Okay. But we still didn't end the setting. It could be possible that Noura, I don't know, just so that I would not probably pay the kafara, she would go and grab some cream cheese or whatever it is and decide to make cheesecake and say, well, I got you some cheesecake. Now you don't have to pay the kafara. Really? All right. I know I'm bringing in some weird hypothetical scenarios, but I'm just making it simple because I don't want to make it sophisticated. Let's see. Can I pay the kafara before? That's the question. The first opinion, yes, you can pay the kafara before you even officially break your oath. That's basically, you would see, 14 of the different companions and majority of the scholars, and even the famous madhab for Imam Malik, it basically said that yes, you already know that that oath is not going to happen. It's not possible. And you already know that your oath is broken. Then in that situation, you can pay the expiation beforehand. Let's see. Abu Hanifa and his friends. What are we talking about? Meaning the Hanafi scholars. They said that no, it wouldn't be considered valid until you officially break that oath. So what is their evidence? Why would they have differences of opinions? Let's see. The group and the scholars that said that yes, it would be valid even before an official breaking the oath happens, and that you would basically give the expiation before even that being valid. So they said, here's our evidence. وإني والله إن شاء الله لا أحلف على يمين فأرى غيرها خيرا منها إلا كفرت عن يميني وأتيت الذي هو خير. He said that the Prophet ﷺ said, وَإِنِّي وَاللَّهِ إِنْ شَاءَ اللَّهِ. He said, by Allah, I do not see any oath, and I would make an oath and see something better than it, إِلَّا كَفَّرْتُ عَنْ يَمِينِي. I would only do that expiation, and I would do what is right. إِلَّا كَفَّرْتُ عَنْ يَمِينِي. And let's see right there. What is the point here? And he said, well, the reason for il-kafara is basically the oath itself. Well, that's why the ayah said, ذَلِكَ كَفَّارَةُ أَيْمَانِكُمْ. The reason for the expiation was because the person had made the oath. The oath was already done. So if the oath was already done, then that's enough to actually consider that you can pay the expiation just by the oath happening. And it doesn't necessarily have to get broken. In other words, you not implementing that oath for you to do the expiation, because it's enough that you had done that oath. That's enough to do the kafara. Let's see. The second group of scholars that said that no, who are they? Well, basically, Abu Hanifa and his basically friends, or the Hanafi scholars, they said, no, that's not valid. You can't actually have that. So what's the evidence? They said, well, here's the hadith. Adi ibn Hatim, he had heard the Prophet ﷺ say, Man halafa ala yamin, thumma, here's the point, ثم رأى غيرها خيرا منها فليأتي الذي هو خير. He said, well, there's the hadith. The Prophet ﷺ said, whoever makes an oath, then, here's that thumma, then he would say that something else is better than it. In other words, he regret making that oath, then do what is needed or what is necessary, and then فَلْيَأْتِ الَّذِي هُوَ خَيْرٌ, then do what is necessary, and then وَلْيُكَفِّرْ عَنْ يَمِينِهِ, and then after that you would basically pay the expiation. So what's the point? They said, well, the expiation itself was actually there in order to not hold the person accountable. In other words, the expiation was an alternative to the person basically held accountable. If the person yet did not break the oath, then there would be no meaning to doing an expiation when the person didn't even commit the sin yet. The expiation was an alternative for a sin, not for the oath. You know, that's what they were saying. I know you're thinking about, the passion in here. Let's see. What's the third opinion? I thought you said 3. Well, he said 3 right there. So here's one first opinion, second opinion. Where's the third opinion? Here's the third opinion. The third opinion basically was mentioned by Shafi'i. What did he say? Well, he said in situations of feeding and freeing and clothing, that is the actual expiation, then in that situation, it can be done before an actual, let's say, voiding or breaking the oath happening. But if we're talking about fasting, then in that situation, it wouldn't be possible for the person to fast unless the person actually breaks the oath. So what does he say? So what he's saying is that for feeding, freeing, and clothing, even if you didn't break your oath, you could do that just by having the oath and you knowing that I don't think it's going to be possible for me to be committed to that oath, then you could do that. But if you're talking about fasting, not until you're really sure you had officially broken the oath, then that's when you would be fasting as an expiation if you didn't have you couldn't afford to feed, free, or clothe. That was basically his third opinion. Let's see. The 20th point, he said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically mentioned the 3 different options, which basically are, let's see, feeding, clothing, or tahrir raqaba. Tahrir raqaba is freeing a slave. Okay, he said, gave these 3 options, and then he said, if فَمَنْ لَمْ يَجِدْ, if these are not possible, that's when you would fast 3 days. So he started with feeding, as it is the best thing for the people in I guess the Arabian Peninsula, because they didn't have enough food. So therefore, that was considered the priority. What did he actually want to get out of this? That kafarat al-yamin is basically, that expiation is basically giving you the option to choose. Should I feed, or should I clothe, or should I free a slave? Which one is best? So according to what he wanted to say is that you actually have the option to choose one of these 3. Okay? But only if you can afford it that you would go for fasting. But which one is better? Well, it depends. The first opinion is that feeding is better. The second opinion, that no, it's not necessarily feeding is better. It all depends on the people's needs within that area or within that time. Okay, so that's why Ibn al-Arabi said, it really depends on the circumstances. And if you were to know that someone is in need of feeding, then in that situation, to feed a needy person would definitely be better, because if you probably would have freed a slave, even though, yes, they need to be freed, but you knew that there was a famine there, all you're doing by freeing a slave, you're just basically adding another number of somebody that's hungry. So in that situation, Ibn al-Arabi was saying, well, which one is better is really going to depend on the circumstances that the people are living in at the time. Now, this is completely important to keep in mind, because oftentimes people would ask, well, which is better? Should I clothe people? Should I pay to feed? Should I do this? Now, this doesn't mean that this is for every single expiation. Certain expiations, you could only do feeding in them. Other expiations, you could only fast in them. Other expiations, you could, well, zakah, for example, there's a certain way. So you can't say, I want to do zakah, and perhaps instead of me doing zakah, I'll basically donate the money to a hospital, or I'll donate money for cancer patients, or etc. No, you don't choose like that. There are certain areas where you would have to take in consideration that Islam considered that as a priority, and therefore you cannot make your own priorities. Okay, just keep that one in mind, because we could see many times people making their own religion and thinking that, yeah, I want to do a good deed and I would like to do it my way, and they would create their own narrative. Let's see, feeding 10 people. Do I have to give it to them, literally, or can I just invite them over? So here, إطعام 10 مساكين, Maliki scholars, they said, no. What you need to do, you need to make sure that these people are in ownership for whatever you're giving them. And therefore, you would have to give it to them. They would be in ownership, and they would determine how to use that money. Not
Would
you
you
determine.
have to would you have to tell them that this is for this actual thing?
So if the situation was you're not sure if they would actually qualify or not, then in that situation, just make sure they do qualify. But if by telling them you're probably hurting their feelings, and you already know that the situation is telling you that they really are in need, then you don't necessarily have to tell them. Just say, well, I would like to donate a meal for your family. And you know, how many people are you? Well, we're 6. Okay, here's a meal or meals for 6 people. And then you've got 4 left. You're going to find a family of 4 or a family of 5 to basically feed. Okay, so let's say, what's the evidence that they have to basically get the full ownership for that and whatever they're doing? Let's see, the Prophet ﷺ, الطعام رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم الجد السدس. Now, literally, it said that the Prophet ﷺ had fed the grandmother the 6th. That's a completely out of context interpretation. That's not what it's saying. At'ama here actually means malaka. That the Prophet ﷺ had basically given the grandmother 6th of the inheritance. 6 of the inheritance, even though they use the word at'ama, but the Prophet ﷺ, it's not that he fed her 6th, it's that he had given her the ownership of 1/6 of the whole inheritance. And therefore, when you're looking at al-kafara, it's the same thing. They would have to have ownership over it, And that's what it means to basically give kiswa as well. Kiswa meaning clothing as well. And as for Abu Hanifa, he basically said, well, if he invited them for, let's say, a dinner and a lunch, then that would be permissible and that should suffice. That's basically Ibn al-Majishun, who was also from the Maliki scholars. They said that's all it needs. If they're basically, I guess, I don't know, inviting them over to this restaurant, and I'm inviting 10 people that are needy, or perhaps, 10 homeless people, and I'm inviting them over to a restaurant and I'm paying, I guess, for their meals, then that situation, according to the Hanafis, and I'm in order to go away and, not get into, are they Muslim, are they not Muslim? For kafarat al-yamin, they don't necessarily have to be Muslim. For zakat, they have to be Muslim. Okay? Kafarat al-yamin, they don't have to be Muslim. Zakat, they have to be, with differences of opinions between scholars. Okay? All right. We're gonna stop right here. I could see it's 1:24. Inshallah, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I know inshallah, we're going to be completing this, inshallah. I really wanted to even continue with these ayat right there. Any questions before we stop right here? Because I don't see everyone here. I know everyone is excited about the elections. So inshallah, we'll see what happens, right? So this is it. Inshallah. Subhanakallah wa bihamdik. Nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. Inshallah, we'll continue tomorrow and more to come. I hope I won't be needing to cancel tomorrow. But